Hi, this is Manisa. This video is going to talk a little bit about how to start a wood burning that has hair, and we're going to be using the spoon shader with the Razertip burning system. Okay, so before we actually start with the hair, I'm going to take a sanding pad and lightly sand up a few of these lines. Now, this hair is pretty dark, so these lines won't be nearly as visible, but if you're burning blonde hair or really light hair, you'll want to make sure and sand these down a little bit more. So turn this over for a minute. So when using the spoon shader for hair, it's important to note how you can get the different textures and strokes. So this has a very flat, rounded side, so you can get really soft shading this way, but if you rock it up and use the tip, you can get much more fine lines. And you'll need both when burning hair. So right now I have the level set on 5.5, which will be probably a little bit too light for what I'm starting with. So I'm going to adjust this up to level 6, and this will help, I think, get me about where I need to be. So remember, if you rock this way up, you'll get these nice crisp lines, and if you rock it down, you can get some softer shading. And, of course, I usually operate kind of in between, kind of in the middle there. So this little girl, she's got some really wispy bangs here, and then her hair is pulled back. So she's going to have a little bit of a part right here. So to start with, I'm going to start sketching in some of the flow and the contours of her hair, and I can do that fairly light to start with. But I'm going to kind of try to stay focused on some of the darker zones. And every time I put the burner down and lift it up, I'm going to have kind of that airplane mode where you set it down lightly and then lift it off lightly. You don't want to set it down, travel, and then lift, because you'll get those harsh stop and start points. I turned it down to about 5.5 on the Razertip setting, just so I can work a little bit more slowly. And this still is a little bit too light. But it's okay to start a lot lighter than you would think and begin by finding the flow of the hair and start sketching those in first. And these lighter areas are going to help you later on to be a little bit more comfortable with burning darker. And this also makes the transition from her hair into her scalp. It's going to help that transition be nice and light, because we don't want harsh areas right here like a line. It's always easier to go darker, but it can be very difficult to lighten up the hair, so we'll lighten up the wood burning later. Now if you feel that you're getting pretty comfortable with doing this, you can turn the burner up a little bit, but you're going to have to be more mindful of how long you leave the point on the wood. So I'm going to turn it up to level 6, just to go a little bit faster. But if you want, you can stay on a lower level and really build up a lot of these hair strokes first and then go back over them later. I'm going to turn it up just a little bit. Now in this section here, it's a little bit darker where it ties into her scalp. And then there's some highlights right in here, so you're going to want longer strokes for the highlights. And then we slow down and burn some slower strokes for some of these darker pieces of hair in here. One of the best ways to create a lot of realism with either hair or fur is lots and lots of layering. It'll look a lot more full and give it more depth than if you try to do this in just one pass. So my burner is still fairly low temp right now as I'm kind of sketching in. Now as you see, this wood has a pretty strong grain, and that's gonna kind of mess with you a little bit because you'll have a single stroke that is usually the right consistent shade, but as you go over these grains, usually it gets darker, so that's kind of a pain. So you notice these lines are all pretty soft. I'm not rocking the point up and really gouging in lots of lines. There's really no denting at all here of the wood. Everything is still light pressure and just kind of sitting up on top of the wood. So just lots of little tiny strokes to build up the hair. And she's going to have a few wispy sections that kind of come down across her face here, and we can put those in. Just make sure that they stay really light to begin with, and then we can increase their darkness a little bit later. But if you ever feel like you're wood burning and you're just kind of out of control, it's difficult to control the burner and you're not happy with the value of the strokes that are going down on the wood, turn the burner down. That gives you so much more control. And it may take some time to fiddle with the temperature dial to get exactly the right temperature that you need. So a little bit of trial and error with that is common. I also recommend keeping like a scrap piece of wood off to the side, so that if you make some temperature adjustments and you're not sure, you think, oh gosh, maybe this is too dark, it's gonna burn and make scorch marks, try it on your little piece of wood first, just to make sure that it's okay. And remember that the Razertip, it heats up really quickly. So if you are working and then you stop for a little bit, that point is going to continue to build heat. So when you come back again, your lines are going to be just a little bit darker. So keep that in mind as well. Okay, so I'm starting to get a little bit blocked in here to where we can see what we're doing. So I'm going to start adding in some of the darker hair up top, and keep in mind that it's not going to be consistent. I'm going to turn this up to about 7. Oh, okay. And we're going to add in some darker V sections in here, because they're not all, it's not just flat across the top. We have hair that kind of comes down and burns a little bit darker in these sections here. But I'm still on a fairly light setting here, even at 7. I still have plenty of control for what I'm trying to do. Now this is not going to be my final value. This is still too light for her dark hair, but you have to have these lighter tones in here to kind of build off of. If hair is all one shade, it's not going to look normal. There are so many variations of light and dark in hair that it's important to have so many different layers here. Okay, now right now my strokes in here are a little bit short, and so it's kind of making her hair look a little choppy. We will go back over that and we can add in some longer, more sweeping sections to make it look like her hair is longer there and not so short. And then we have to blend these down into the lighter sections too. So try to train your eye on the darker sections and burn those in, and make sure you blend them in to everything else. Okay, so this is a good start here. Just gotta keep building up these layers. Now I have kind of a big part in here. We'll have to go back in and pull those hairs down a little bit more. But as you can see, whenever we start a stroke for the hair, it has a gradual and a smooth transition. It doesn't just start with a big end and then fade down. So part of that is with the control, turning the temperature down so you don't get that hard edge when you put the burner down. Yeah, these wood grain is really kind of messing with me here on this. Adding just a few wispy hairs coming down across her face here. Now when you burn long strokes, You can either burn them in one long section, or you can kind of bleed it together, kind of fade it in. Either way is fine, whichever works best for your hand. I find that I have a little bit more control when I do shorter sections, but you can just see what works best for you on that. Also, in some of these darker sections, it's okay to kind of rock the burner down and get a little bit more of the shading aspect. Instead of putting in all those little lines, you can fill in the hair a little bit with shading once you get some of those main strokes in there, and that can save you some time too. So here I'm just using a softer edge, kind of rock that point down a little bit. And you can move the burner nice and slow and build up some darker values in here. So what we do to start with the strokes, that's what I call texture. And then what we're doing now is we're adding in some shading. So hair and fur is a real nice combination of shading and texture. And a lot of times I put in the texture first and then shade over the top of that. So if her hair is looking maybe a little bit too coarse and stringy, then you'll want to go in and add some more shading in there and kind of soften it up a bit. Because your eye sees the individual strokes that we did for the texture, but you have to kind of balance that out with shading to make it look realistic. So it's a little bit of a balancing act. Now if you don't have enough texture, then her hair is going to look too flat. So texture and shading, very, very important. Okay, now overall her hair is still a little bit too light, but that's okay. The more layers, the better. Add a few wispy hairs down here. Build in some more fur strokes. Haha, I was working on a tiger recently, and so I'm used to talking about fur, but hair strokes, just building in more hair strokes here. Generally, whenever hair ties in to skin, try to make those transitions nice and smooth. Okay, so right now her part is really big. We're going to kind of close that in here a little bit by using some downward strokes here on the top and some upward strokes on the bottom. Now it's important to vary your strokes a bit. Hair tends to have overall a consistent flow. I mean, most of it goes in one direction and then it'll turn and go in another direction. But if you look closely, the individual hairs, they do have kind of their own way of going. They're not, everything isn't exactly parallel when it comes to hair. So make sure that you remember to vary your strokes just a little bit. And so we can pull down some of these darker values closer here. And just keep building up our values. Building up our layers. It's also important to take a step back once in a while and look at your picture as a whole, because sometimes, we get so caught up in these fine details and we're looking really close at each individual aspect of the burning that sometimes we forget to take a step back and look and make sure and see if what we're doing, all these little details, are they working together as a whole? Now, when you first start out and you're just kind of building up your layers and you're putting in your information that you're seeing from your reference photo, it's okay just to stay focused on those little aspects. But don't forget, as your project continues to progress, you need to take a step back and literally get back away from your work and kind of, even kind of blur your eyes a little bit and see how everything is working. How do your values compare? Are you overall, is your piece too light? That's kind of where we are right now, is everything is just a little bit too light here, but that's okay, we're still building up our values. Pyrography is not a fast art form. It takes time and lots of layers to build everything up correctly. So I'm putting in a little bit more softer shading in here for the part. I'm going to pull some down here as well. So I'm not really doing those individual strokes. I'm adding more shading in here to kind of smooth out this transition of the part where the bangs are. Okay, now I would continue to build up your darker values in these sections here. This is definitely a good start. Her hair is darker up top, and we know that there's some wispy pieces that are going up into the background, but the background is kind of light as well. So she's not going to really have this hard edge here. So I'm going to take some of that out. Take out those guidelines. And since the back of her head is going to be pushed away from the viewer, usually things tend to get a little softer and a little bit blurrier as they get farther away from the viewer. So I'm going to kind of just do some shading in here for now, because I don't want the focal point to be the back of her head. And if you add in a real hard edge and lots of little details there, then the viewer's eye is going to be drawn to that area. And I want the viewer to be focused more on her eyes and her face than the back of her head. And we'll continue to darken that up as we go too. Now, she's got a little bit of a ponytail here in the back, and so she has some wispy pieces in here. I'm going to turn the burner down a little bit and start kind of putting in just some real soft values there. It would be helpful to get rid of some of these graphite lines as well. But just kind of, if you want to stay true to the reference photo, just make these nice and light in here. Light and blurry in the background. So real soft edges and a lower temperature for that area. And then she's got a little ponytail here. It looks like a little ponytail holder, a little rubber band. So I'm going to turn this up a little bit more, and we're going to kind of go around the ponytail. And once again, towards the back of her head, try to keep your strokes a little bit more on the softer side, using a little bit more shading and not as much hard texture keep your shading point kind of rocked down. And I'm going pretty fast here. This is kind of a pretty fast sketch, but just to show you how to build up some of these areas and different ways to use the point. And obviously we're going to want to darken these areas up in here to match the reference photo. But you certainly want lighter strokes. I guess softer strokes is a better way of putting that. You don't want nice crisp edges like we have here for these wispy pieces that come across her face. You want to rock that point up and get those hard edges in here. Okay, because that's definitely a focal point. But towards the back, it's okay to make it a little bit blurrier. So softer strokes. Okay, so this is a pretty good start on this overall. Definitely want to continue building up the darker areas up here with a combination of texture and shading, as it looks like in the reference photo. Make things a little bit blurrier back up here towards the top, kind of smooth out some of these harder edges. Don't forget that you can blow on the point to cool it down. Sometimes it can be frustrating to constantly have to fiddle with the temperature gauge, but just by lightly blowing on the point, it can really help give you just a little bit more control in tight spaces, and then you can, you know, just keep going as normal. And you may get to a point where you cannot get any more dark values on your current temperature setting. So once you get kind of all these midtones laid in, and you have a nice base of values already built up, you can turn the point up a little bit more and kind of continue to build up the darker values in here. So feel free to, my cord keeps getting stuck. But lots of layering strokes, yeah, lots of layering, and a combination of texture and shading is where you want to be. So overall, kind of the top of her head here needs to be a little bit darker. Going to add some longer strokes. Okay, so we're kind of at the end of our tutorial here, but keep in mind that this is just a start. These are just some tips to get you going with the hair. This is not done, not by far. It needs a lot more darker values, a lot more blending and smoothing and shading along the way. But these are just some tips to help you get started.